Hello, this is teacher Jean-Claude Heshiman. Today we are going to analyze the poem The Three Fates by Rosemary Dobson. Let's start by reading the poem The Three Fates. At the instant of drowning, he invoked the three sisters. It was a mistake, an aberration to cry out for life everlasting. He came up like a cork and back to the river bank, put on his clothes in reverse order, returned to the house. He suffered the enormous agonies of passion, writing poems from the end backwards, brushing away tears that had not yet fallen. Loving her widely as the day regressed towards morning, he watched her swinging in the garden, growing younger, barefoot, straw-hatted. And when she was gone, in the house and the swing and daylight, there was an instant's pause before it began all over, the rear and roaring towards the river. Now, before we go further, it's better we start by looking at some vocabularies, the meaning of some vocabularies, some difficult vocabularies. Fates, which is also known as the Moira goddesses, who appeared in Greek and Roman mythology. Now, the Fates were said to weave the threads of life for mortal beings, creating the destiny of each human on earth, which means fates determine your death and your life. Instant, that is moment. Aberration, that is something unusual or different from the norm. Then agonies, these are feelings of great pain. Then reel, it may have two meanings, either a fishing reel or a spool that fishing line winds around that unroll when casting a fish rod into the water. Or it may be also a film reel, which is a recording of film that is kept wound around a cylinder so that it can be played by projectors. Now, whenever you are analyzing a poem, it is better you start by analyzing the contexts, where, when, what is the background information of the poem. And of course, in this poem, in this presentation, we are going to start by looking at the date. When was this poem written? That is in 1984. Remember, Rosemary Dobson was born in 1920 and died in 2012. She's an Australian, so she was born in Sydney, Australia, and lived in Canberra, that is a city in Australia. The Fates or Moray, there are three characters in mythology. In other words, in Greek mythology, they believe that there are three goddesses. They are females, and these three goddesses, they said that they hold the threads of life for mortals, which means there is one which is in charge of the beginning of the person's life, there is another one which is supposed to measure it, and there is another one which has to put an end or cut her thread. Now this signifies, or this means, that death and the mortal is transported to the underworld. They correspond to the idea of fate, that what happens to us in life and our moment of death is outside of control, which means we can't control our death or our life. And that our time of death is predetermined. So which means you can't go beyond the determined time by these goddesses. If you are supposed to live maybe 20 years, so when it is time, you have to die. In the poem, they are called sisters. Sometimes they call them three sisters, suggesting their connected nature, which means they are somehow related. The man, now in the poem, the man asks for their help. He's about to drown, then he asks their help. But as often happens in Greek myths, the fates grant his wish, but not in a way he expected. Now, continuing living becomes now some kind of, becomes more painful rather than a pleasure. It becomes a trouble rather than freedom. Now, in the poem, we are presented a certain man who was about to drown. Then he doesn't want to die. Then that's why he invoked the three sisters or the three goddesses to extend or to change. Now, the poem explores the famous concept that life flashes before your eyes when you die, a phenomenon that is said to happen to many people at the moment of death. Now, who is the speaker, or what is the voice in the poem? When you try to analyze the poem, there is a third-person omniscient narrator. A third-person omniscient narrator, that is, we are told the story from the third person, that is he or she or maybe it. And omniscient means the perspective from which we get the poem. It seems he knows everything. He can tell us what happens, what is visible and what is not visible. Now, this omniscient narrator speaks in the past tense, which means in the poem we are told it is like something which happened, telling us about an event that has already occurred. And the narrator tells us what happened to the unnamed subject. We are told it is he, but which means that is male, it's not female, but we are not told the name, which may also represent any male. In the final moments of his life, and then as he refused to die. He instead was forced now, after now invoking the three sisters who granted his wish, he was now forced to relive his life, playing backward and forwards forever, from the moment of his birth up to the moment of drowning. So which means they granted the wish, but he lived in a reverse order. We have a sense that the speaker sees this alternative to death as a form of constant suffering and torture, and that is an unnatural way to exist. It seems that he prefers the idea of natural death to eternal life. So remember, the male who was about down, he invoked the three sisters to give him life eternal. But the problem is that the man could not enjoy what was given to him. However, there is also a tone of sadness to the poem as it is being told in the past tense. We realize man has already made his decision to ask for eternal life. Now, we should know him because he's the one who asked. Now, in summary, this is what is told in the 5 stanzas. Now, in stanza 1, the poet or the speaker tries to tell us the speaker tells us, or the persona tells us about a man who made a mistake. Because he was drowning, and of course he was about to die, but instead of accepting to die, he called to the 3 fates to make him immortal or to give him life eternal. That is what we get from the first stanza. Now, stanza 2, after being granted his wish, he lived his life in reverse. He rises to the surface of the water, he puts on his clothes and goes home. But the way he put on his clothes, it was in a reverse order. Now, stanza 3, the man suffers as he lives his life backward. He writes poem. Whenever he was writing poem, he was writing them in reverse and wipes tears before even he cries. So which means whatever was happening to him was happening in reverse order. instead of beginning by the first line, he would begin by the last line when he was composing poems. A poem. Stanza 4. Now we are presented a certain her or she. Now a woman is introduced in this stanza. We assume she is maybe a partner. The man's life is running backwards, so he watches her become younger and turn back into a child. It seems now this man had a wife, but instead of growing old, the woman was growing. That is from the perspective of the man. He saw her growing backward, becoming a child, then it grows again, then it comes. But that was only from the perspective of the man, not from the perspective of the woman. Now stanza 5, as now the man reaches the beginning of his life, there is a short pause, and then his life unravels again before him. Like a film reel, that is where reel comes in. Now this suggests that his immortality, the fact that he is not mortal, will be spent constantly going back and forth through his memories and experiences, from beginning to end, back again. So, which means, because the man was given life eternal, everlasting, so he would not die. So he never lives any more than he already has, but he never dies either. So imagine if you then you don't die. By the time you're about to die, you become a child again, then you grow. That was the situation. Now, when you are analyzing a poem, it is also very crucial, very important to refer to the structure of the poem. Now, we have seen the poem has 4 stanzas. And the first line is also a complete sentence. It tells us the essential information that we need to know in order to contextualize the rest of the story. As time is reversed in the next few stanzas, it stands out visually and in terms of reading, as a moment of pause is created by the full stop at the end of the line, whereas now the rest of the poem has free-flowing stanzas that only stop at the end. Now, when you try to read the poem, some lines feel abrupt and only half finished. It seems they are not even finished. Like life everlasting, return to the house, barefoot, straw-hatted. Now, these underscore the concept of or images. They try to create a certain image in our mind, making them stand out to the reader as if they mark significant moments in the man's life. The moment he chooses immortality, the moment where he reverses his death and returns home, and the moment where he watches his love turns back into a child, whilst presumably doing the same thing himself. As the line length gets shorter throughout the stanzas, this could represent the man's reverse aging as he transitions back towards the beginning of his life. Which means, by looking at the length of the line, the fact that a line is short, this shows that now the man's life has already started again. So he was an adult, then becomes, instead of dying, then he's a child again and comes back. Now, the poet also uses tacets. A tacet is a stanza of 3 lines. Now, the stanzas are all 3 lines each, perhaps maybe representing, of course, this one suggests that it represents also the 3 fates themselves. And remember, the 3 fates, they are 3, of course, they are 3. So, which means maybe the 3 tacets represents the 3 fates themselves. And maybe, or the concept that 3 is a magical number. Now, though the line length is irregular or varies, this irregularity of stanza length perhaps references the tension between order and chaos in the world, or between fate and free will, where people are forced to die. It seems they are forced to die. And the man was acting in a sense from free will by refusing to accept death. But of course, in the end, this still led to the fates controlling his every action, as he's just forced to relive his life over and over without change or progress, which means nothing changed. He thought he would live a better life, but unfortunately, he was now somehow confused. A mistake and an aberration. Now there is what we can call parallelism. That is a repeated grammatical structure where we use a, which is an article, indefinite article, then mistake, which is a noun. A mistake and aberration. So there is a use of parallelism in the structure of this line. Now the parallelism of this phrase disrupts the flow of the sentence, which reinforces the point through repetition that something went wrong. Remember, an aberration is also a mistake. So repeating it seems the poet really reinforces a very serious mistake that the man has made. So the man went wrong, that something went wrong, and the man's life was not ended. It emphasizes the abstract nouns mistake and aberration, which suggests that the event was normal or natural. So he has made a mistake. He should not complain that he's living in a, if I can call it, a special life which was not good. Now there is also a flashback. The entire poem reverses the typical chronology of time. So it could be said to be using the technique of flashback. So we are told something in the past. Even from the beginning, you find that we are told the story of something which happened. Although these are usually a skipping back to a single moment in the past, which was drowning, rather than a full progression of someone's key life events. So which means the flashback taking us back in the life of the speaker in the poem. Of course, this also shows us that there is something which is bad which happened. There is also use of, we can also say that there is an allegory. Of course, an allegory, it is like a story which refers to another well-known story, something which happened in the past. Now the poem is in the form of an allegory, a story that heavily uses or references another well-known story, something which happened. It assumes the reader knows about the fates. Of course, not every reader knows what we mean by fates. So he's referring to the other three fates in Greek mythology, and what their purpose was in Greek mythology. We could interpret that the poem has a mythological or fairy tale feeling to its own narrative too. It seems the poet was by Greek mythology, because in Greeks believed that their life, the length of their life is really determined by these fates. So which means the guy made a mistake of asking them to extend his life. Now let's look at, whenever you are analyzing a poem, you have to look at how the poet uses language, poetic devices or language features. Now when you read the poem, the poet uses a simile. And the simile is a comparison of two things which are not the same, using the word like or as. He came up like a cork. Now the action of the man coming out of the water, now they are comparing the coming out of the man out of the water The action of the man coming out of the water as he reverses, his life is compared or is likened to a popping cork in a wine bottle. How it moves very fast. It usually shoots out with a lot of force and causes a popping sound, of course, which creates a feeling of intensity and pressure. This is also reinforced by the alternative k sound. He came like a cork, so which means there was some kind of pressure. He was really forced. He wanted really to live again, not to drown. Now the poet also uses open vowels. Open vowels, that these are vowels. When you are reading them, you open your mouth. Enough mass, agonies of passion. This phrase, of course, contains a lot of vowel sounds. A, no, mass, so agonies. And to speak it aloud, it encourages the reader to open their mouth wide, an effect which imitates the intense pain and the pleasure that the man feels as he lives his life. Now, I think you can now feel it. When he was now relieved, he was granted his wish, he would really shout. And of course, he felt some pain as he was trying to live again because of drowning. He tried, and finally, he was saved somehow. Now, agonies and passions also create an oxymoron. Oxymoron is when two words which are opposite or which are opposing, which have opposing meaning, are put together. They are somehow juxtaposed, as they seem like they should not exist. So agonies and passion, they should not exist, which enhances, of course, the sense that the man's actions are unnatural. They are not natural. Another interpretation may be that these pleasures of his life, once experienced in reverse, become a kind of torture rather than something beautiful, which means putting agonies, which is suffering, and passion, which seems something that you like so much, putting them together also, they show that the man who expected to enjoy life, who expected something beautiful, something that would bring happiness to him, has wrought now pain. It is perhaps a moment in the poem where he realizes his mistake in not accepting that. In other words, he should be regretted. He should be dead. Now, in the poem, the poet also uses, there's a use of continuous verbs like writing, brushing away, loving, swinging, growing. Now, these continuous verbs, or these verbs which I have been using, ing, they create a sense of constant movement and flow, showing how the man's life rushes past him as it reverses, and his experiences are in a state of flux. Now, the phrase growing younger seems impossible. It seems to some kind ironic. How can someone grow younger? So we grow old. Again, it is also a kind of now growing younger. It is also a kind of oxymoron, or even contradiction. We can even call it maybe paradox, which underscores the abnormality of the situation. Now, the poet also uses compound adjectives when the poet was referring to the girl or the woman. Now, barefoot, straw-hatted, as the man's life rushes back to its beginning, the descriptions of his experiences compress, and the pace of reading becomes faster. Remember here, the poet has used what we call compound adjectives, an adjective which is made of two words. They have the effect of speeding up our reading. They help us to move very fast. Now, of course, there is also a use of visual imagery, creating an image, helping us to see what is happening. Barefoot, you can see someone who is barefoot, but almost in not form, as if by this point his life is flashing quickly before his eyes. So whatever is happening, it seems is moving very fast. Now the poet has also used consonants, that is repetition of a consonant in the middle or at the end of words, consecutive words. Now the rear, there's a unroaring two words, the river. So we have repetition of r, the rear, roaring, river. Now the constant r sound that recurs throughout, that comes back in this line, creates a roaring feeling which imitates the motion of the reel itself, which we may imagine as a film reel or perhaps as a fishing reel, because we are talking about drowning and we drown in water. Either way, it may symbolize the thread of life. Reel can symbolize the thread of life, that the fate's control for each human being. Now, of course, you are advised to continue to read and identify other poetic devices or written devices which the writer or the poet uses. Allow me to move to the themes. What is the poem about? What are the main topics which we can... What are the main ideas? What is the message? But let's talk about the theme. And this has to be universal. Themes should be universal, should be applied everywhere. When you are reading a poem, we are not only reading it in a... When a poet writes a poem, he doesn't write it only for maybe his own people. Now we need now to analyze the themes. Now, theme of death is found in this poem, because the man was about to die. And also we are talking about three fates. Now death is a natural part of existence. We should really accept death. So we should not fear or even fight against it, because in the death is natural, so we should really accept it is part of our existence. In the poem, it seems that there was a right time to die. Now it seems it was time for the man to die, and it shows that also accepting death, it would be natural. But the fact that the man refuses or avoided natural death, it caused him sufferings. Now that's why he's suffering. Another thing is fate versus free will. Now, the question is, do we have control of our lives, or are they subject to forces beyond our control? Now, religiously, maybe those who are religious, a religious interpretation of the poem would suggest that we have our correct times to live and die, and that we should not fight against the process of nature. And that is all. We are born, we grow, and we die. So trying now to look for another alternative, it may bring more problems. That's what happened to this guy. Now we could interpret the man's suffering that he imposes upon himself as coming from hubris or arrogance or pride. So he would be proud that for him he cannot die. Now as he feels he does not deserve to die at that time, and so tries to change his fate. So which means if you have to die, accept a death, don't fight, because your free will can bring more problems. Now there is also happiness in the poem. The poem explores the complex relationship between pleasurable and painful experiences. If you don't Of course, even if you don't accept death, expecting happiness, it becomes a problem. So the poem explores there's a complex relationship between pleasurable and painful experiences. The guy wanted to continue to live, to enjoy life. So happiness, what he thought was happiness, becomes now painful. There is also love and relationship. We see the relationship of the man and the woman in reverse. The man sees the woman he loves from his own perspective, which is everyone who is growing in a reverse order from the perspective of the speaker in the poem, from the man's perspective. So, and yet the woman or the girl was enjoying life. Now, there is also mythology. Of course, the story itself, it reads like a myth because you are told about the three fates. The characters are all archetypal. They represent other characters than the real. They have no names or distinct features. They are only called the three fates or three sisters. Perhaps it is intended to be read as a more of a warning to not push too hard against the natural way of things rather than a real story. So it is somehow a myth that we should not push. If death comes, don't push, don't change. But that is how life is. You are born, you grow, and you die. That is the end of the analysis. Of course, you may go further. Thank you. Now let's, as we are analyzing this poem, this is one of the poems that are in IGCSE for Cambridge, those who are doing Cambridge. It is one of the poems that we are supposed to analyze. I hope you have enjoyed the presentation. Now the assignment, question 1. How is death conveyed together with the theme of time going backwards? Question 2. What impact could the three sisters have on the poem and the protagonist? Remember, the protagonist is the other man who didn't want to die, who was about to drown. Why could the comparison of like a cock, which is a simile, have been used to describe the protagonist floating up in the river? That is the end of